Hey y'all, it's Miss Osborne coming back to you for another WSQ. Today we're going to be looking at the Nixon and Carter presidencies. As you watch the video, make sure that you answer the guided questions provided. It's okay if you have to pause or rewatch the video in order to answer the guided questions. When the video ends, make sure that you summarize the main points of the video in paragraph form using the specific vocabulary given to you on your WSQ sheet. During the video, these are going to appear as bolded and underlined words. And then finish by asking one question, something you're still confused about, a general question, or a discussion question for the class. The essential question that we're going to be addressing during this WSQ is how did the United States adjust to a new century through ideological and cultural differences, foreign policy concerns, economic globalization, and changes in science and technology? Spartan historians will evaluate the differences between conservatism and liberalism in ideas and culture, foreign policy, economic globalization, and science and technology. Nixon had a reputation as a very strong conservative. He was really tough on communism. He believed that the government had gotten simply too big under the Democrats, and he wanted to return the power to the states. This has kind of become the new definition for a conservative: small government. His plan was to return the power to the states through a plan called New Federalism. The key part of the plan was called revenue sharing, in which the federal government would give states block grants or blocks of money to spend with more freedom instead of telling them exactly what to spend the money on. Nixon overall also wanted to appeal to white Southerners because they were starting to get really upset about civil rights. His goal was to slow down integration, encourage white Southerners to start voting Republican. During his years as president, most of the South that had been Democratic since the end of Reconstruction started to vote Republican and still do to this day. Nixon also believed that the government was not doing enough to combat drug use and crime. He was worried about if we had given the people who were being accused of these crimes too many rights and also limited the power of the government to combat these types of crimes. He appointed several conservative judges to promote his more conservative views. Even though Nixon was a champion for conservative causes like smaller government and combating crime, he is willing to take a more liberal stance on other issues like food stamps. He increased funding for food stamps, and he also increased the payments for Social Security, increasing the amount of money that older Americans got. In 1962, Rachel Carson published one of her most famous books called Silent Spring that talked about the harmful effects of chemicals like pesticides on the natural world. This followed Silent Spring in 1970, Earth Day, which was launched to share ideas about environmental protection. In addition, in 1970, the Clean Air Act regulated the levels of air pollution by factories and other sources like cars. Today, our government meets with other governments around the world to talk about whether or not we are meeting these certain standards. It also required cars to be tested by the federal government to make sure that they're not giving off too much pollution. In addition, Nixon also created the Environmental Protection Agency, also known as the EPA, that enforces government laws and regulations about pollution and sues different companies if they're breaking those laws. In 1970, Occupational Health and Safety Administration, otherwise known as OSHA, worked to prevent work-related injury and illness through safety standards and training. A lot of people had gone through many, many years, including back up to the 1900s with the Shirtwaist Fire Factory, without having any sort of real safety regulations. It also encouraged affirmative action hiring for minorities and women to get priority in hiring. During the Cold War, Nixon had changed from containment to a new policy called realpolitik, which based foreign policy decisions on power and not on what's best for the United States. He really wanted to show the Soviet Union that they had a lot more power. He dealt with the most powerful countries, ignoring the other ones that were weaker. He also followed a policy of détente because he wanted the Cold War to be over. He eased the tension with old Cold War enemies, including the Soviet Union, starting to sign more liberal ideas of conservatism. He also began talks with the USSR, or the Soviet Union, that led to the signing of the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, or SALT I Treaty. There is a SALT II Treaty, but that comes a little bit later. The SALT Treaty reduced the number of nuclear weapons that the United States and the Soviet Union built. This was a step in the right direction by decreasing the arms race. Nixon wanted to improve relations with China in order to increase U.S. trade. This was a part of the détente policies. If he started to have a better relationship with China, it would also put a lot more pressure on the Soviets to have better relationships as well. But Nixon had to be really careful because the United States did not want to formally recognize the communist government in China, only the exiled nationalist government that was democratic in Taiwan. In 1972, Nixon traveled to China to establish trade and put pressure on the Soviets to sign the SALT I Treaty. The U.S. sided with Israel in a lot of the conflicts that happened in the days after Israel had been established as a state. It was having a lot of issues with the Arab nations' neighbors like Egypt and Jordan and Syria. During the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War, in which both the United States and the Soviet Union intervened, OPEC had placed an embargo on oil exports to the United States. About a third of the United States oil came from OPEC. This caused gas prices to rise to astronomical levels, like you can see in the top right-hand corner. The sales are limited to 10 gallons per customer, and sometimes it got down to once a week. Higher gas prices also meant higher prices for everything else because of the cost of production and transportation. The National Security Advisor, Henry Kissinger, used shuttle diplomacy in order to try to help decrease the conflict between the United States and OPEC. They also wanted to work out an agreement to end the fighting and also the embargo. There were separate deals between Israel and Egypt and Israel and Syria. Eventually, the conflict and the embargo came to an end, but the conflict within Israel and the rest of the Middle East would never stop. One of the major goals of NASA was to manned moon mission. Part of our space race with the Soviet Union, we were trying to be first in order to get a man on the moon. By July of 1969, Apollo 11 mission had made its way to the moon, and Neil Armstrong was the first man to land. Millions of Americans were able to watch this on television. As Nixon approached the re-election in 1972, he faced a lot of economic trouble. Both inflation and unemployment were really high. In order to ease the tensions, he tried to institute a 90-day price and wage freeze. It worked during the freeze, but the prices continued to rise after the freeze had ended in relation to the time that it had been stopped. In the election of 1972, Nixon started to get really concerned. He started getting a little paranoid about whether or not he was going to win. So he created a group called the Plumbers with Ehrlichman and Hadelman to dig up dirt on all of Nixon's opponents. When Ellsberg released the Pentagon Papers after the Vietnam War that criticized his handling of the Vietnam War, they broke into the psychiatrist's office to find information to damage his credibility. Early in 1972, Nixon's team broke into the Democratic Party headquarters to collect information on their election strategy and to bug their phones, trying to make sure that the Republicans would win the election in 1972. However, those two, Ehrlichman and Hadelman, were caught, and two reporters from the Washington Post, Bernstein and Woodward, investigated the break-in, and they were able to find links to the White House. At first, not a lot of people paid attention, and Nixon was reelected. However, in February of 1973, 7 men that were connected with the break-in had to go to prison for their crimes, and other details started to emerge that linked the White House even closer and closer to the break-in. The Washington Post continued to report, and the public started to take interest. Nixon had announced his own investigation, trying to act like he was on top of things, including they found several members of the administration were either fired or resigned, including Ehrlichman and Haldeman, that were then responsible for investigating and breaking into the Democratic headquarters. Congress also asked for an independent investigation apart from the president. In May, the Senate committee began its own investigation hearings, and they were all televised. The major question that they really wanted to know was, what did Nixon know, and when did he know it? That changed everything. John Dean told the committee that he spoke with Nixon about the break-in and cover-up many times. By July of 1973, the former presidential aide, Mr. Butterfield, revealed that Nixon had tape-recorded all conversations in his office. And so now the witch hunt went for the tape recordings. Nixon had refused to give access to any of the tapes to anybody, saying that he had executive privilege over these tapes. He had the right to keep these conversations private because he wanted to ensure open and honest advice. Any conversation about Watergate, however, was not protected by executive privilege and was subpoenaed by the court. So Nixon, in an effort to try to make sure that he was protected, held a Saturday night massacre in which he ordered Attorney General Richardson to fire Cox. He refused to fire Cox, and then he resigned, as did his assistant. Finally, a third-ranking official agreed to fire Cox. Nixon at this point was pretty much on the defensive. We went on television and he started telling everybody, "I am not a crook." But the White House eventually did release the tapes, but mysteriously 18 minutes were missing. People started calling for impeachment, saying that he was actually having criminal behavior. In the spring of 1974, he did release the transcripts of the tapes, but this wasn't good enough. They wanted the actual tapes. The Supreme Court ordered Nixon to turn over the tapes in Nixon versus the United States. The House Judiciary Committee voted finally to bring full impeachment charges on the White House. Instead of being impeached, Nixon resigned. Spiro Agnew, who had been Nixon's vice president, had forced to resign earlier over tax evasion, completely unrelated to Watergate, and so the new president would be the House Republican leader, Gerald Ford. He became president when Nixon resigned. Ford had promised a time of national healing, but he angered a lot of Americans because he granted Nixon a full pardon. Many Americans felt like the government had taken too much power from them, and this was no excuse. Ford had attempted to tackle the inflation by cutting government spending, but he ran into opposition because most of the Democrats controlled Congress at this point. They had passed several new spending bills, and they were not about to cut government spending. Ford was also blocked when he tried to send additional aid to South Vietnam after we had already pulled out. North Vietnam had already taken over the entire country. He was also unable to send aid or forces to fight communist rule in Angola. Ford also continued the policies of détente and realpolitik and kept Kissinger as his Secretary of State. As Ford continued to be president, the relations with the Soviet Union continued to improve, but he had some serious political problems and barely got the nomination in 1976. Carter, who was the next president, was elected due to his deep faith and his Washington outsider reputation. He kept his campaign promise to pardon Vietnam draft dodgers. He also brought a lot of different attention to energy by creating the Department of Energy and reducing energy consumption. He reduced our dependence on foreign oil by lifting regulations on domestic oil production and investing in alternative energy resources. He also believed in conservation of energy, and so he passed the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act to set aside 100 million acres in Alaska and also double the size of the national park system. In 1979, 3 Mile Island, which was a nuclear facility in Pennsylvania, suffered a partial meltdown, starting to threaten the environmental hazards. Love Canal, New York, also discovered toxic chemicals buried in the neighborhood yards, and so the state had to buy all 200 of the homes and clean up the toxic mess. Carter overall also had no previous foreign policy experience. He wanted to focus on human rights. And he criticized the Soviet Union's restrictions on human rights, including the freedom of speech, but the Soviet Union refused to reform. When they signed the SALT II Treaty in 1979, the United States and the Soviet Union agreed to limit certain types of nuclear weapons, and we were starting to move in the right direction. By 1977, Carter signed a treaty with Panama that agreed to turn over control of the Panama Canal to Panama in 1999. In 1979, he also recognized the communist government in China. But his greatest foreign policy achievement was the Great Camp David Accords, which was a peace agreement between Israel and Egypt that ended some of the tensions that had been occurring in the Middle East. In 1978, the government of Afghanistan overthrew the communist-backed government by the USSR. The government had been threatened with a coup, and when the Soviets tried to invade to prop up the government, the U.S. responded by blocking a shipment of grain to the Soviet Union, and also boycotting the 1980 Olympics. Many thought the action was too weak and that we should have taken some more action. In 1979, though, the Shah of Iran is overthrown and Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, an Islamic leader, come to power. His message was strongly anti-American. When the United States allowed the Shah to come to the United States for cancer treatment, the Iranians attacked the U.S. embassy and took 52 Americans hostage, leading to the Iranian hostage crisis. They were held for 444 days. Carter was unable to get them released, which led to his failure to win the re-election in 1980. The hostages were finally released after Reagan took office, minutes after he took the oath. As you watch the video, make sure that you answer the guided questions provided. It's okay if you had to pause or if you need to rewatch the video now in order to answer the guided questions. When the video ends, summarize the main points of the video in paragraph form using the specific vocabulary that appeared as bolded and underlined words during the video. And then don't forget to ask one question, something you're still confused about, a general question, or a discussion question for the class. Thank you for taking time to watch this WSQ, and I'll see you in class.